Hello, friends. I'd like to tell you a story that's an old legend, and it all starts out on a cold, dark, moonless night with millions and millions of stars in the sky. And in the middle of that night, a young man walks into a village. And the village is completely dark, not a light shone in any of the houses. And the young man came to the first house in the village, and he banged on the door, and he cried out, "Please help me. My wife has just had a child, and we are in need of some coals so we can start a fire." But no light came on, and the door didn't open. So he went to the next house, and the next, and the next, and the next. But never did a light turn on or a door open for him. And finally he came to the last house in the village, and he banged on the door. But all was quiet in the village. And so he turned his back on the village, and he looked out across the hills and the fields, and far off in the distance he could see a light. It looked like a fire. And so he made his way as quickly as he could through the night, across the fields, toward that fire. And as he approached, he noticed that there was a shepherd sitting by his campfire. And surrounding him were his flock of sheep in a circle around the fire. And as he drew closer, 3 dogs rose out of the shadows, and they started to bark at him. And as they opened their mouths to bark, nothing came out. And nevertheless, they ran at the young man, and their teeth were bared, and their nostrils were flaring, and their teeth were gleaming in the light of the fire. And they came up to bite at him, and one went for his leg, and one went for his other leg, and another one went for his arm. And just as they went to bite him, they realized that they couldn't close their mouths around him. Their mouths were stuck open. They couldn't bite. And finally they gave up, and they whimpered off back into the shadows. And the young man drew up to the flock, and now the old man, the old shepherd, was an old, gnarled man. And he had been watching this, and he had seen his dogs, but he did nothing to stop them. And he looked at this young man as nothing but trouble. What else would he be out here in the middle of the night? And the young man drew up to the edge of the flock of sheep, but the sheep were sleeping so close together that you couldn't see the ground between them. There was no way to step through them. And so he called out to the shepherd, "Good shepherd, can you help me?" And the shepherd looked at him with narrow eyes and a cold heart. Just drew the cowl further over his face, and he ignored the young man. So the young man looked at the sheep, and he stepped up onto the back of the sheep and started walking across the backs of the sheep, like he was walking across large stones in a river. And this was too much for the old man, and he picked up the staff that he had that was sharpened to a point at the end like a spear. And he drew the staff back, and he threw it as hard as he could at the young man coming across the backs of the sheep. Now, this old shepherd was good with the spear, because he was used to jackals, having to fight off jackals and lions, and he was really good with his aim. He knew how to use it. And the spear was coming directly at the young man, and just as it was about to hit him, it veered off and was gone into the night. And the young man kept walking across the backs of the sheep, not paying any attention to that the old man was throwing things at him. And he jumped off into the inner circle where the old man was next to his fire. And he said, "Good shepherd, please, can you help me? I am in need of some coals. My wife has just had a baby, and we need to create a fire so we can warm ourselves." And the old man was just about to tell him to get lost when he noticed that the young man had no shovel to get the coals out of the fire, and he had no pail to carry them with. So he looked at the young man and he said, "Sure, take all you want." Gratefully, the young man said, "Thank you," and he knelt by the fire, and he took off his cowl and placed it down in front of him, and he sunk his hands into the middle of the fire and grabbed 2 heaping handfuls of coals out of the fire and placed them on his cowl. Don't try this at home. And he drew up the corners of the cowl, and the old man was just about to tell him that surely the coals would burn through his cowl. But before he could, the young man had picked up the cowl and walked across the back of the sheep and was gone. Now the old man thought for a moment, and he realized the dogs could not bark or bite. The sheep didn't wake up when he stepped on their back. The coals did not burn his hands or scorch his cowl. This is no night like any ordinary night. And so he cried out to the young man, "Wait!" But the young man was too far away and he didn't hear him. And so he grabbed his satchel and set off after him, following him by the glow of the coals in his cowl. And he followed the young man back into the village, and he saw on the other side of the village, he saw him go into a little shed. And so he walked through the village and came up to the shed, and he knocked on the door of the shed. The young man opened the door, and he came inside, and he saw there a young woman seated on a stool. And by her was a little feeding trough or manger filled with hay. And inside the hay was a little baby. And his heart went out to the baby, being born in such cold and humble circumstances. And he remembered that he had a sheepskin in his pack. And he drew it out and he offered it to the young man. And the young man took it, and they picked up the baby and put the sheepskin on the hay and put the baby back down on the sheepskin. And just as they did so, the little baby woke up and stirred. And the old man knelt down beside the baby, looking at him. And the baby turned his head and looked at the old man. And their eyes met. And the old man had the strangest feeling that this little child was the truest and dearest friend that he had ever had. And as they looked into each other's eyes in that breathless moment, the old man and the little baby in that cold stable on that dark night And the old man felt wave after wave of love washing over him. And he had the strangest feeling that this little baby knew all the meanness in his heart, all the bad things that he had done, all the selfishness that he had. And still he felt wave after wave of love just washing over him, filling him completely. And after a moment, the little baby, his eyes grew heavy. He dropped off back to a quiet sleep. And the old man rubbed his eyes and he got up. And he smiled at the young couple and he turned to leave. And it was then that he noticed them. Angels. Dozens of angels filling the stable. Beautiful angels. And not only that, but when he opened the door and walked out, there were angels surrounding the stable, singing the most beautiful music that he could even imagine. And he realized that the angels had always been there. But he had changed, and now he could see them, and he was grateful. And he walked off through the village, back to his fire. And another group of shepherds from another field walked up to him with wide eyes and wonder. And they said, "We saw angels. They said there was a child." And he smiled and he just pointed off to the shed. And he walked back through the cold night across the fields to his fire. And he sat down by his fire and he gazed for a long time into the glowing embers. And he realized that he would never be the same again. May the blessings of Christmas fill your heart.